The first few days of silence following a breakup are rarely quiet. Instead, they often possess a peculiar, buzzing intensity, much like the persistent static of a television tuned to a dead channel. We find ourselves navigating a mental landscape where the absence of a person feels less like a void and more like a physical weight, a presence that demands our constant, involuntary attention. It is frequently a period of relentless dissection, where past conversations are replayed on a loop and every silence is scrutinized for some hidden, unspoken meaning. Yet for many, a curious shift begins to occur after a few weeks. The unbearable roar of that silence often starts to soften into something more manageable, even reflective. It is important to remember that these time frames aren't deadlines. We all adapt at very different speeds, moving through the fog of transition at a pace that is uniquely our own. To understand this transition, we might look at why the mind often reacts so strongly to the sudden cessation of contact. Human connection tends to function much like a gravitational pull. We often organize our routines, our thoughts, and even our sense of self around the orbit of another person. When that person is suddenly removed, our internal compass doesn't always just stop. It may spin wildly, trying to find north in a world that has lost its primary landmark. No contact, in this sense, is more than just a lack of communication. It can be seen as a period of forced psychological adaptation. It is a time when the mind is tasked with reclaiming the significant amount of mental energy that was once entirely occupied by the relationship. In those initial mornings, the sense of disruption can feel deeply visceral. After months or years of shared patterns, the mind remains conditioned to expect a certain rhythm. You might find your hand instinctively reaching for your phone before you are even fully awake, a reflexive search for a morning greeting that is no longer there. This is the mind acting as a predictive engine, reaching for a stimulus it has been trained to anticipate. When that expectation is met with silence, the result can be a jarring sensation of loss, a sharp, repetitive friction that occurs every time a habit hits a dead end. For many, this feels less like a simple choice and more like the difficult process of unlearning a deeply ingrained part of their daily life. The human mind is a creature of habituation, and it often struggles with sudden silence because it tends to dislike unresolved narratives. Every notification from a stranger or every song that echoes a shared moment can become a trigger for looping, a state where the mind tries to solve a problem that no longer has a clear solution. In these moments, we may not just be missing a person, we are often mourning the loss of a routine. The silence feels loud because it represents a break in the fundamental rhythm of our lives, leaving an echoing space where a significant portion of our identity used to reside. This initial intensity is frequently driven by a lingering sense of urgency, a feeling that something must be done to ease the discomfort. Our minds may spin through endless what ifs and should haves in a quiet attempt to regain a sense of control over an unpredictable situation. The absence of contact isn't always a passive state. For many, it feels like an active, roaring presence that colors every interaction and every quiet moment. It demands our attention not because we choose to give it, but because the mind often perceives a sudden shift in connection as a challenge to its emotional equilibrium. By the second or third week, however, the nature of this silence may begin to evolve for some. It often stops feeling like a weight and starts feeling more like a question. We might notice that the silence has become even more profound than any disagreement that preceded the breakup, primarily because it represents the unknown. It is a boundary that can feel impenetrable. This is often where true introspection begins, not in the heat of conflict, but in the cool, sometimes uncomfortable shade of non-communication. We are prompted to confront the thoughts and motivations that were perhaps masked by the constant noise of the relationship. As this period unfolds, the emotional experience tends to be non-linear. One afternoon might bring a surprising sense of clarity or a moment of genuine enjoyment in a simple meal, only for a specific scent or a passing shadow to trigger a sudden wave of longing by evening. This inconsistency can be disorienting, making us feel as though we are making no progress. Yet these fluctuations are often just the internal gears of our perspective finding a new rhythm. These highs and lows are rarely signs of failure. They are often the natural signs of a system trying to find a new center of gravity. We might find ourselves checking social media with a strange, almost detached curiosity, looking for clues to explain the current reality. These urges are often less about a desire to re-engage and more about a search for cognitive closure, a way to reconcile the person we once knew with the silence of the present. It can feel like a quiet tug-of-war between a heart that seeks the familiar and a mind that is gradually accepting a new status quo. The path forward rarely feels like a straight line. It often resembles a winding road where the destination is frequently obscured. Crucially, it helps to recognize that a good day doesn't mean the journey is over, just as a difficult day doesn't mean we are back at the beginning. Progress in this landscape is often measured by the frequency and intensity of the waves, rather than their complete disappearance. When we stop viewing our distress as a problem to be solved and begin to see it as a natural process of the mind finding a new sense of balance, the pressure to get over it often starts to lift. Each moment of calm is a small indication that the mind is successfully building new anchors for its attention. By the third or fourth week, many people notice a subtle but significant shift in how their internal resources are allocated. The mental energy that was once hyper-focused on the other person, analyzing their moods or reflecting on their absence, may start to leak back into other areas of life. This isn't usually a conscious decision. It's an organic reclaiming of the self. You might simply realize that you haven't checked your phone in hours, or that you were genuinely interested in a conversation or a project for the first time in a while. This newfound space is often quiet and unassuming. It often manifests as a loosening of that magnetic pull to see if the other person has reached out. The grip of expectation may begin to soften, allowing the mind to wander toward the present reality rather than dwelling on a hypothetical future or a curated past. We are, in a sense, recentering our own lives. Our routines and our own needs, which may have been pushed to the periphery, gradually start to move back toward the center of our consciousness. In this stage, memories of the relationship may still surface, but they often lose some of their immediate reactive power. You might recall a shared moment without feeling an overwhelming compulsion to act on it. This is the development of what we might call observational distance. It allows us to acknowledge a feeling without being completely hijacked by it. The memory still carries meaning, but it no longer dictates our immediate actions. The sting may still be there, but the initial shock often begins to fade, allowing for a more reflective engagement with our own history. This shift likely occurs because the human mind is remarkably adaptive. Patterns of thought that are no longer being reinforced by active communication tend to eventually quiet down. At the same time, the thoughts and habits associated with our independent life, our hobbies, our work, and our other connections, begin to grow stronger through simple daily use. We are, in effect, finding a new way to experience the world. There is a profound realization that can occur when you go half a day without the other person being the primary focus. The realization that you are surviving and perhaps even beginning to move forward on your own. That realization that we can function and even find moments of peace in their absence often triggers a complex cocktail of emotions. For many, the primary feeling is relief, a quiet acknowledgement that a heavy burden is starting to lift. but that relief is frequently accompanied by a strange, subtle sense of guilt. We might wonder if this shift means we are betraying the depth of what we felt. It is a confusing moment where feeling better can, ironically, feel like a loss of loyalty to the past. However, the most profound pivot in this journey is often not that we have stopped caring. It is simply that the relationship has stopped being the primary occupant of our attention. This is a critical distinction that is often misunderstood. Recovery isn't usually about reaching a state of total indifference. It is about regaining agency over our own internal landscape. It is about moving from a reactive state, where our mood is dictated by someone else's silence, to a more reflective state, where we choose how to navigate our own thoughts and the echoes of our past. There is a significant difference between the raw, often defensive declaration of, "I don't care about them anymore," and the more nuanced, deeply personal truth of, "I still care, but I am no longer hijacked by the memory." The former is often a shield, a way to protect ourselves from a pain we may not have fully processed. The latter, however, represents a quiet internal revolution. It is the moment our emotional responses may transition from being automatic reflexes to becoming something more like a choice. In this state, we aren't necessarily erasing the past, we are simply reclaiming our agency over the present. As this perspective deepens, many find themselves viewing the relationship through a more detached lens, as if observing a scene from a quiet, safe distance. The urgency of the immediate emotional reaction often begins to wane, making room for a more balanced inventory of the past. We may start to remember the warmth of the connection alongside the friction of the incompatibilities, without one side drowning out the other. This complete picture, unclouded by the desperate need for immediate engagement, can provide a clarity that was previously obscured by the emotional intensity that often follows a breakup. In this space of observation, we may begin to recognize patterns that were once invisible to us. We might see the behavioral dynamics, both theirs and ours, not as a series of moral failings, but as a system of interaction that simply didn't work. This shift often allows us to understand what we tolerated and, perhaps more importantly, why we felt the need to do so. This isn't about assigning blame, it's about objective recognition. By separating the emotional narrative from the actual behavioral data, we can begin to distinguish between the person we miss and the reality of the situation we left behind. This leads to one of the most pivotal moments of clarity in the journey of healing, the realization that missing someone and wanting a relationship back are not always the same thing. It is entirely possible to genuinely miss the shared laughter, the comfort of a routine, or the feeling of being known, while simultaneously understanding that returning would mean returning to a dynamic that was unsustainable or unhealthy. This realization can transform the story from one of simple yearning into a complex, mature understanding of self-worth and boundaries. True emotional maturity often involves the ability to hold these conflicting truths simultaneously. We can acknowledge the enduring affection we may have for someone while firmly maintaining the boundary that keeps us apart for our own well-being. This isn't a sign of weakness, it is a sign of a robust internal world. Once we can coexist with our memories without feeling compelled to act on them, the power dynamic of the past typically begins to dissolve. We are no longer waiting for the other person to change the narrative. We are writing the next chapter ourselves. At this stage, the focus of the silence often shifts away from the other person entirely and settles on the self. The silence becomes a mirror. It may prompt us to ask, what part of my identity was I outsourcing to this relationship? Why did I feel that my worth was contingent on their validation? These can be uncomfortable questions, but they are often the bedrock of genuine personal growth. We begin to see that this period of distance wasn't just about losing someone else, it was about finding the parts of ourselves that had been pushed to the periphery. This is where many begin to rebuild their own internal blueprint. We start to construct routines that nourish us for our own sake, rather than as a reaction to someone else's presence or absence. We identify what we truly need and, perhaps more importantly, what we can provide for ourselves. The emotional triggers that once sent us into a spiral may become recognizable signals, data points that help us navigate our own needs with greater self-awareness. For some, this is the moment they stop building a life around a person and start building a life around their own purpose. No contact, when viewed through this lens, is far more than a strategic countdown or a tactic to get someone's attention. To treat it as a game of who blinks first is to miss the transformative potential it holds. For many, it becomes a protected period of time. It provides the quiet necessary to notice how the relationship was shaping our attention and impacting our fundamental sense of self. It is a journey of rediscovery, an opportunity to step back into our own autonomy without the constant noise of another person's expectations. This healing rarely happens as a sudden cinematic revelation. Instead, it is usually a gentle, almost imperceptible unfolding. We eventually arrive at the understanding that our identity exists independently of any romantic entanglement. Our worth is inherent, not something that can be granted or revoked by another person's presence. This self-recognition is a cornerstone of resilience. It allows us to step into the future not as someone who is broken, but as someone who is informed by their history and empowered by their growth. Perhaps a definitive sign of progress isn't that you've stopped thinking about the person altogether. For many, certain memories will always occupy a corner of the mind. Instead, the real measure of success may be that the thought no longer has the power to derail your day. The memory becomes a thought rather than a command. You can remember them with a touch of fondness or a hint of sadness, yet remain firmly rooted in your current reality without an overwhelming urge to break your own boundaries. This autonomy is often the ultimate goal of the journey. It is the ability to care deeply about what happened and what was lost, while refusing to let those feelings dictate what happens next. It is the realization that your internal shift, this newfound peace, is primarily information about your own evolution, not necessarily a sign of what the other person is thinking or doing. Keeping that focus inward is often what protects the integrity of your personal growth. In the end, the reason no contact feels so different after a few weeks is because the experience of distance has fundamentally changed your relationship with your own mind. You have begun to break the habit of seeking external validation for your emotional state. You have learned to sit with the silence until it stopped being a threat and started being a teacher. You are likely finding that you are no longer simply reacting to your environment. Instead, you are becoming someone who is increasingly capable of responding to their own emotions from a place of growing internal resilience. The objective was never to become someone who erases their past. That is likely impossible and would rob us of our wisdom. The goal is to become someone who can walk through the gallery of their own history, looking at the portraits of past loves and past mistakes without being trapped inside the frames. It is about being present with the past, yet entirely oriented toward the future. This is the quiet empowerment of long-term silence. It is the realization that the void wasn't empty after all. It was simply the space you needed to finally hear yourself think. And as you move forward, You do so with the knowledge that while you may still care, you are no longer waiting. You are simply living. Reflecting on your own journey, was there a specific moment when the silence stopped feeling like a burden and started feeling like a relief? When did you first notice that your perspective had begun to shift? Understanding these turning points is a vital part of the process, reminding us that while the path of healing is rarely a straight line, it is always leading us back to ourselves.